Wire snapped tight against Cade Mercer's palm, slicing through old calluses as the canyon dust choked the air. Below, 3 riders fanned out across the dry creek bed, Winchester rifles riding high in their saddles. Their shadows stretched long over the split rock shelter where Elder Tovan lay breathing in shallow, rattling pulls. Cade didn't reach for his own iron. He pressed his boot against the leaning gatepost, felt the rusted hinge groan, and shoved it shut instead. The mob's lead rider barked an order to turn aside, voice cracking over the wind. Turning a blind eye meant keeping his water well intact, his fences unburned, his name unspilled in the mud. But Cade stepped back into the shade, dropped a canteen beside Tovan's cracked leather blanket, and watched the first bullet kick dirt from the threshold. He could run. He could let the canyon swallow them both. Or he could hold the line, wondering if shielding a forgotten man would ever outweigh the heavy tribute waiting on the high ridge. Dirt plumed against his boot tops, sharp and stinging, as he dragged a splintered timber across the dirt floor. He wedged it under the warped latch, listening to iron scrape stone, while the wind outside carried the metallic click of rifle hammers. Tovan's fingers twitched against the wool, nails cracked and blackened from days without shelter. Cade knelt, pressing 2 fingers to the elder's wrist, feeling a pulse that fluttered like a trapped bird. He pulled a dented tin cup from his coat pocket, poured 3 careful drops from the canteen, and tipped them past dry lips. The water vanished instantly, leaving only a faint, bitter taste of oak and old canvas. Every drop cost them tomorrow, but leaving a man to choke on dust was a debt he refused to carry. He stood, knees popping in the quiet, and turned toward the narrow gap where daylight bled through the rocks. The canyon walls pressed close, cool and damp, trapping the smell of sage and gunpowder. He wiped a smear of grime from his cheek, leaving a pale streak, and checked the heavy revolver at his hip. The leather holster was worn thin from years of riding fence lines, not drawing blood. That habit would have to change. He moved to the rock face, tracing the familiar scratch marks left by decades of passing cattle. Now only boot prints scarred the hardpan outside, heavy soles with uneven tread. Local men, ranchers who knew the water table better than the lawmen did. Cade dragged a canvas tarp across the alcove entrance, pinning it beneath 2 loose stones. Dust settled on his shoulders like ash. He adjusted his grip on the timber brace, feeling the rough grain bite into his palms, and listened. The riders outside shifted their mounts, leather creaking in restless rhythms. A sudden wind dropped, silencing the dry grass. The canyon held its breath, then crack. A pine branch snapped somewhere above the ridge, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the stillness. Cade's head snapped toward the sound. The branch broke the waiting tension. He scanned the high lip of the canyon and saw nothing but heat shimmer and scrub oak. The tracks outside belonged to 3 men, but the warning belonged to someone who knew how to hunt from above. He checked the brass cylinder of his rifle, feeling the cold steel bite into his thumb. 3 rounds left, enough to buy hours, not days. The shelter felt smaller now. He had to move water before the sun climbed higher. Cade slipped a coil of rawhide rope over his shoulder and crept toward the back fissure, boots finding familiar depressions in the shale. The passage narrowed until his ribs scraped both sides, forcing him to exhale slow and shallow. Cold air brushed his neck, carrying the faint scent of iron-rich soil. He followed the damp trail until it opened into a hidden wash, where a sluggish trickle pooled around gray stones. He dropped the rope, untying a battered canvas bucket from his saddlebag, and lowered it with steady hands. The wood creaked under the weight, each pull a careful negotiation with gravity. Water sloshed over the rim, spilling onto his forearms, chilling his skin. He hauled 3 full buckets to a shallow cache behind a boulder, covering them with dry brush to mask the damp earth. Every step echoed too loudly in the narrow space. He paused, pressing his ear to the canyon wall, listening past his own breathing. The distant crackle of dry brush burning finally reached him. The mob had lit the lower gully, sending a plume of black smoke against the pale sky. Fire would push the game out, but it would also seal the exits. He tightened the rawhide straps around his forearms, feeling the familiar pull of old muscle, and turned back toward the shelter. The air grew heavier with each yard. Tovan's breathing had grown shallower by the time Cade slid back through the fissure, his boots leaving dark prints in the dust. The elder's eyes were open, fixed on the canvas tarp, tracking the shifting shadows with quiet dread. Cade knelt, untying a leather pouch from his belt, and shook 2 strips of dried venison onto a flat stone. He offered the smaller piece first, watching the elder's trembling hands close around it. No words passed between them, only the sound of slow chewing and the relentless scrape of wind against stone. Cade chewed his own ration methodically, jaw aching from the tough meat, and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He checked the gate brace again, testing the timber's weight, knowing it would hold against horses but not against dynamite. He pulled a small brass compass from his vest pocket, its glass face scratched but needle steady, and set it beside the water cache. North was still north, even when the borders bled. The dry wind carried the scent of pine resin and distant rain, a cruel tease against the cracked soil. He paced the narrow perimeter, feeling the walls close in, measuring the distance from threshold to rock. 3 strides, 4, enough to turn and fire, enough to die standing up. The heat outside climbed, warping the air above the brush. He adjusted his hat brim, shading his eyes from the glare, and waited. Hoofbeats finally broke the quiet, slow and deliberate, approaching from the creek bed. A single rider stopped at the edge of the cleared threshold, reins slipping through gloved fingers. The man's duster was faded canvas, collar pulled high against the dust. "You're burning your own name, Cade," Silas Vance said, voice low and even. "The county judge won't shelter you when they bring the warrant. Give him to the trail and walk back to town." Cade didn't look up. He kept his eyes on the brass compass, feeling the metal warm under his thumb. "I keep my gate shut," Cade replied. The reply was quiet, but it carried past the timber brace. Silas exhaled, a sharp sound that mixed with the wind. "Then they'll take the water first. You'll watch it dry up with him." Cade finally met the man's gaze through a gap in the tarp. Silas hesitated, jaw tightening before turning his horse. Hooves clicked on stone as he rode away, the sound fading into the dry wash. Cade stood, stepping into the narrow gap where sunlight still fell across the dirt. He drew his rifle, not to fire, but to pry. He dragged the heavy iron latch free from the gate post and drove it into the main water trough's copper pipe. A sharp hiss followed, then the dull thud of a ruptured line. Water bled into the sand, vanishing instantly into the thirsty earth. He stepped back, wiping his hands on his trousers, leaving dark streaks across the fabric. The well was still sealed, but the surface flow was gone. Now the canyon would hold only what he carried, and nothing would draw the mob closer. He braced the timber wedge tighter, feeling the wood bite into the stone, and locked eyes with the elder. Tovan's hand moved, slow and deliberate, pressing against the dirt floor, a quiet acknowledgement. The gate would hold until nightfall, or it would break. Cade sat back against the rock, rifle across his knees, and listened to the wind return. The wind returned, cold and sharp, carrying the scent of dry pine and crushed sage. Cade kept the rifle heavy across his knees, knuckles pale against the dark walnut stock. He counted his breaths, matching them to Tovan's shallow rhythm, feeling the damp chill seep through his trousers and bite at his hips. The elder's eyes had closed, but his chest still rose in jagged, uneven increments. Cade shifted his weight, boots grinding softly against the hard dirt, and reached for the brass compass resting near his thigh. North remained steady. Outside, the shadows lengthened, stretching thin and brittle across the rock face. The mob hadn't fired again. That silence felt heavier than the shots. He stood, joints stiffening against the cold stone, and moved to the fissure. Through the canvas tier, he scanned the lower creek bed. No riders, only the fading tracks of Silas's horse cutting a clean arc across the dust. Vance had left a warning, but he hadn't left a path. Cade knew the posse's pattern. They would wait for dusk, then use the cover of falling light to close the distance. Fire would flush him out, or it would burn the canyon dry, leaving only ash and bone. He checked the timber brace, testing its weight against the post, feeling the rough grains scrape his palm. It would hold against a single shoulder, maybe two, not against axes. He pulled a heavy iron file from his coat, running it slowly along the rifle barrel's edge. The rasp of steel on metal filled the cramped space, steady and deliberate, cutting through the quiet. Tovan's breathing hitched. Cade stopped, listening. The elder's hand curled against the dirt, fingers tracing a faint symbol in the dust. A broken wing or a fading circle. Cade didn't ask. He wrapped the wool blanket tighter, feeling the hollow bones shift beneath thin fabric. The gesture cost him nothing but time, yet it anchored the shelter to something older than the feud. He moved to the rear cache, dragging the canvas buckets closer. Water sloshed, cold against the tin rim, spilling over his wrists. He measured 2 handfuls for the elder, pouring them slowly past cracked lips. Tovan swallowed, eyes fluttering open, then closed again. The minor crisis passed, but the well outside would freeze if the temperature dropped, and the canyon's only surface water was already bleeding into the thirsty sand. Cade tightened his grip on the file. He would have to move before the frost set the ground hard. The wind shifted, carrying a new scent, wood smoke faint but unmistakable drifting down from the eastern ridge, not a cooking fire. Pine resin, pitch. Cade crawled to the gap, pressing his cheek to the cold rock. A single plume of grey smoke curled against the darkening sky, followed by another, then a third. The posse was marking the perimeter. They weren't coming in yet. They were claiming the high ground, forcing him into the basin. The smoke meant torches were ready. It meant the standoff had entered its final hour. Cade pulled back into the shadow, feeling the weight of the brass compass in his palm. He set it beside the water cache, aligning it with the elder's resting place. The compass glass caught the fading light, reflecting a dull amber gleam. He had hours, maybe less. The choice was no longer about holding the gate. It was about deciding whether to wait for the fire or walk into the timber and draw them out before the wind shifted again. A sudden drop in the wind silenced the dry grass. The canyon held its breath. Then a sharp, metallic snap echoed from the ridge line, not a branch, a tripwire breaking. Cade rolled to the left, pulling the rifle tight, barrel sweeping upward through the gap. Dust kicked against his boots, stinging his ankles. The crack hung in the air, followed by the frantic rustle of disturbed brush. Something large had crossed the line, or someone had cut it deliberately. He held his position, finger resting outside the trigger guard, listening past the blood in his ears. The silence stretched, thin and brittle. Then came a low, guttural sound, not human, a wounded horse shifting weight in the timber above, dragging a tangled rein through dry leaves. The wire had been set for riders, not for beasts. The posse had rigged the high trail, counting on him to flee upward when the fire came. Cade exhaled slow, feeling the tension drain from his shoulders. The trap was visible now, and it left the lower wash wide open. He checked the timber brace one last time, feeling the wood bite into his palm, and made his choice. He dragged the canvas tarp aside, stepping out into the cooling dusk. The air bit at his face, sharp with frost and dry earth. He slung the rifle across his back, pulling his coat collar high against the wind. Tovan stirred, a soft groan escaping his throat as the blanket shifted. Cade paused, looking back at the shelter. He couldn't leave him, not with the posse holding the ridge. He knelt, sliding his arms under the elder's knees, feeling the startling lightness of him. Bone and worn cloth. He lifted, adjusting the weight against his chest, and turned toward the narrow wash. Every step sank slightly into the cooling sand, pulling at his boots. The canyon walls narrowed, shadows pooling thick along the rock base. He moved carefully, tracking his own footprints, knowing the mob's scouts would read the dust by first light. The elder's head rested against his shoulder, breath hot and shallow through his shirt. Cade kept his eyes forward, scanning the darkening tree line. The timber grew denser, pines leaning inward like a closed fist. He felt the familiar ache in his lower back, the same strain from years of hauling fence posts. He ignored it. The wash turned north, curving around a jutting basalt outcrop. He pressed his back against the cold stone, listening. Hoofbeats, distant, slow, rhythmic, patrolling. He shifted his grip on the rifle, feeling the cold metal bite into his ribs. The patrol was wide, spread thin across the ridge. They expected him to run toward the high pass. He was walking into the dead end instead. The temperature dropped further, frosting his mustache with thin ice. He moved again, boots crunching softly on dry gravel. The canyon opened into a shallow basin, rimed with early frost. He lowered Tovan gently against a flat rock, draping the canvas over him. The elder's eyes opened, dark and lucid, tracking the sky. Cade didn't speak. He pulled a handful of dried jerky from his pocket, chewing slowly, feeling the salt sting his cracked lips. The silence of the basin felt heavy, waiting. A shadow detached itself from the tree line, not a rider on foot. A man in a heavy duster, hat brim pulled low, hands resting visibly at his sides. Cade's thumb brushed the rifle's hammer, feeling the cold steel edge. The man stopped 10 yards out, boots planted on frozen mud. "You walk deeper into the cold, Cade," Marshal Elias Thorne said, voice flat and carrying over the still air. "The county won't pay for a man who runs into a blizzard with stolen property. Hand him over, ride back to town, keep your name clean." Cade kept his thumb on the hammer, feeling the metal warm slightly from his grip. He looked past Thorne's shoulder toward the dark timber. "The canyon doesn't hold thieves, Marshal," Cade replied. Thorne's jaw tightened. He shifted his weight, hand hovering near his coat button. "Then it holds a corpse by morning. The snow is already falling on the ridge. Your tracks will disappear, so will he." A sudden gust swept through the basin, carrying the first flakes of wet snow. They caught in Cade's lashes, cold and sharp. The wind dropped as quickly as it came. Thorne turned, stepping back toward the pines, his boots leaving fresh prints on the frost. The warning hung in the cold air, heavier than the snow. Cade watched him vanish into the timber, feeling the weight of the words settle into his coat. He turned back to the shelter, adjusting the canvas against the wind. The first heavy flake landed on the rock beside Tovan's hand, then another. The storm was moving fast. He gathered dry pine needles from the rock face, stacking them beneath a shallow overhang. The wood was brittle, snapping cleanly under his fingers. He struck a match, shielding the flame with his palm, and touched it to the kindling. Smoke curled upward, thin and gray, quickly swallowed by the falling snow. He needed heat, not visibility. He pulled the heavy wool blanket closer, draping it over both of them as they sat against the stone. The cold seeped through his boots, numbing his toes. Tovan's breathing slowed, steadying against the chill. Cade watched the timber line, tracking the shifting shadows. Snow accumulated fast, filling the ruts of his own tracks, burying the trail. He felt a strange calm settle over him, the kind that comes when options run out. The posse would rely on sight now. The storm had taken that advantage, but it also took the escape route. He shifted his rifle, checking the brass casing, feeling the cold bite into his fingers. Hours passed. The wind howled through the pines, carrying the sound of shifting timber and distant, muffled voices. The mob was regrouping, forced off the high ridges by the whiteout. They would try the lower wash. Cade pressed his ear to the frozen ground, feeling a faint vibration. Boots, many of them, moving through the deepening drift. He stood slowly, shaking the snow from his coat, and stepped into the open. The basin was empty save for the falling flakes and the dark outline of the canyon walls. He raised the rifle, not to aim, but to brace. The vibration grew louder. Then a sudden crack shattered the quiet. A warning shot, fired high into the timber, sending a spray of ice and bark raining down onto the snow. Cade didn't flinch. He lowered the rifle slightly, keeping his eyes on the tree line. The posse wasn't shooting to kill yet. They were testing the ground, pushing the herd. He took a step backward, feeling the frozen mud shift under his boot. The trap was closing, but the snow gave him one advantage. They couldn't see the wash drop. He moved to the edge, peering down into the white void, a shallow gorge 20 feet deep filled with drifts. He turned back, feeling the weight of the decision. He could lead them in, or he could stand and break. He adjusted his grip on the rifle stock, feeling the worn walnut bite into his palm. The familiar groove of old thumb wear aligned perfectly with his hand. A habit forged over years of solitary fence riding. He traced it now, using the pressure to steady his breathing. The snow fell thicker, piling against his shins, masking his outline. Voices drifted through the pines, muffled but clear enough to count. 4, maybe 5. Moving in a loose line, probing the snow with rifle butts, tapping rhythmically against hidden stones. They were reading the terrain by sound, blind to the drop. Cade shifted his weight, boots sinking deeper into the drift. He knew the gorge floor held a narrow ledge, just wide enough for 2 men. It would force the posse to funnel, stripping their numbers, but it would also strip his retreat. He turned back toward the overhang, pulling the canvas tight against the wind. Tovan's eyes were closed, face pale beneath the heavy wool. Cade knelt, pressing a canteen to the elder's lips, feeling the ice crack against the metal rim. The elder drank, swallowing slowly, breath fogging the cold air. He didn't open his eyes, but his hand moved, fingers brushing the dirt beside Cade's boot. A faint tap. 2 taps, then stillness. Acknowledgement. Cade stood, wiping his mouth with the back of his sleeve, feeling the salt and cold mix into his skin. He checked the brass compass one last time, feeling its weight settle against his palm. North was buried under white, but the gorge remained east. He slung the rifle, stepping back into the storm, boots crunching heavily toward the timber edge. The posse's voices grew louder, closer, punctuated by the sharp snap of breaking branches. They were crossing the hidden line. He stopped at the tree line, pressing his shoulder against a thick pine trunk, feeling the rough bark scrape his coat. He raised his voice, letting it carry over the wind. The wash drops here. Step forward and you won't step back. The words hung in the cold air, swallowed quickly by the falling snow. Silence answered. Then a single boot crunched on frozen gravel, followed by another. They didn't stop. Cade gripped the rifle tighter, thumb finding the familiar groove, and braced against the wind. The first shadow emerged from the white, rifle raised, boots testing the edge. Cade held his ground, breath steady, waiting for the ice to crack. If you rode with me this far, you know the cold hasn't broken Cade's line. He stands in the snow, waiting for the ice to give while the posse measures the drop. But winter always thaws, and so do old grudges. When the sun finally cuts through, the Marshal won't bring rifles. He'll bring a writ that demands more than blood. The canyon's silence is about to shatter under a heavier weight. If this tale grips you, drop a like and subscribe to keep the trail open. Then tell me in the comments exactly where you're riding from. I track every border just to see how far this story travels before it ends. The thaw is coming. Stay close. The ice cracked first, a sharp, splintering sound that echoed off the basalt walls. The lead rider's boot shifted forward, seeking purchase on the hidden ledge. The drift collapsed under his weight, sending a cascade of powder into the gorge. He stumbled back, arms flailing, grabbing at pine branches as the rest of the line froze. The storm had already claimed the ground. Cade kept the rifle steady, watching the white veil swallow the men's outlines. They weren't advancing, they were measuring. The wind howled, carrying the metallic scent of coming rain. The posse backed away, boots retreating into the timber, leaving only broken branches and fading tracks in the slush. Cade didn't lower the barrel until the rhythm of their retreat faded into the pines. He turned back to the overhang, feeling the cold seep through his coat. The standoff had bought time, not peace. He knelt beside the stone, brushing snow from the canvas tarp. Tovan's breathing remained steady, a quiet rhythm against the storm's fury. Cade checked the water cache, finding a thin crust of ice over the tin rim. He broke it with his knife, feeling the blade catch against the metal. The well outside would need digging when the thaw came. He adjusted his grip on the rifle, tracing the worn groove on the stock, and waited for the wind to shift. The thaw arrived slow, dragging mud and slush through the lower wash. Cade cleared a narrow path to the spring, boots sinking deep into the cooling earth. Each step pulled against his shins, heavy and deliberate. He hauled buckets of muddy water back to the shelter, pouring it through a folded wool screen to filter the silt. The process took hours. He repeated it daily, measuring drops against hunger, knowing the grain sacks in the root cellar dwindled with each passing week. Tovan sat against the rock wall, eyes tracking the shifting light through the fissure. He spoke rarely, offering only quiet gestures when the water ran low or the fire smoked too thick. Cade learned the rhythm of the silence. He mended fences when the weather held, using rusted wire and salvaged posts to reinforce the perimeter. The work kept his hands busy, kept the mind from weighing the cost. He rubbed the rifle stock's groove when tension tightened his shoulders, a habit forged in years of solitary patrol. The brass marks on the walnut felt familiar, grounding. He checked the perimeter at dusk, scanning the high ridges for movement, nothing but scrub oak and fading trails. The mob had pulled back, waiting for the law to finish what the storm interrupted. Spring deepened into early summer. The mud dried into pale crusts, cracking under the morning sun. Cade adjusted his routine, rising before dawn to check the wire lines. The fences sagged where the frost had heaved the posts. He pulled them straight, wrapping new rusted strand around weathered pine, feeling the wire bite into his gloves. Each twist of the pliers cost him time he couldn't spare. He rationed the remaining grain, splitting each portion into thin handfuls, feeling the hollow ache in his ribs when the day ended. Tovan adapted quietly, sitting in the shade of the overhang, hands resting loosely in his lap. He traced symbols in the dust, slow and deliberate, mapping the seasons without words. Cade learned to read the shifts. A deeper line meant drought approaching. A wider circle meant rain on the high mesas. He followed the signs, adjusting the water catchments, reinforcing the canvas against the blistering sun. The canyon felt smaller with each passing day, walls pressing closer, trapping the heat and the silence. He kept his hands flat against his thighs when the tension rose, refusing to fall back on the rifle groove. The habit had served him in the cold. Now it felt like a tether to fear. He stood at the ridge line at noon, squinting against the glare, watching for dust plumes or shifting shadows. Nothing moved. The homestead sat quiet, fences holding, water cache steady but low. The law hadn't returned. The posse hadn't tested the gorge again. The stillness felt fragile, held together by patience and stubborn routine. A sudden wind dropped, silencing the dry grass. The canyon held its breath. Then hoofbeats finally broke the quiet in late spring, steady and deliberate, cutting through the morning mist. Cade stepped back from the ridge, pulling his hat low against the glare, and moved toward the shelter. The ground trembled slightly under his boots, a subtle vibration that traveled through the packed earth. He reached the threshold just as a single rider emerged from the tree line. Marshal Elias Thorne sat tall in the saddle, duster damp from dew, a folded parchment held loosely in his gloved hand. The horse stopped 10 yards out, breathing heavily, nostrils flaring against the chill air. Thorne dismounted with careful grace, boots settling into the damp earth. He approached the shelter, eyes fixed on Cade's face, reading the tension in his stance. "I carry a county writ," Thorne said, voice level and carrying over the quiet yard. "Judge orders surrender of the tribal elder for unlawful harboring. You answer to territorial law, Mercer, not frontier pride." Cade didn't move from the doorway. He felt the familiar urge to rub the rifle stock, but forced his hands to hang still at his sides. The brass compass sat heavy in his pocket, ticking softly against his thigh. "The law doesn't cross this line," Cade replied. Thorne's jaw tightened. He unfolded the parchment, letting the crisp paper catch the morning light. "This isn't a request, it's a boundary. You keep him, you lose the deed. The water rights transfer to the county by default. You'll starve on paper before you starve in the dirt." Cade held his gaze, feeling the weight of the threat settle over the yard. He reached into his coat, pulling a small, hand-carved wooden figure from his pocket. The piece was worn smooth, edges darkened by years of handling. He placed it on the rough-hewn porch table, letting it rest against the splintered wood. "I answer to the ground," Cade said. Thorne stared at the carving, then at the rifle leaning against the frame. He didn't touch the document. He simply nodded once, slow and measured. "Then you'll hold the line until it breaks." Thorne turned, walking back to his horse, boots heavy on the damp porch boards. The sound faded into the yard, leaving only the rustle of dry grass. Cade watched him ride out, feeling the tension drain slowly from his shoulders. The warning hung in the air, heavier than the humidity. He stepped inside, closing the door against the light, and checked the grain sack. Half empty, enough for a month if they stretched it. Weeks bled into the dry summer heat. The sun baked the canyon floor, cracking the earth into pale tiles. Cade adjusted his routine, rising before dawn to check the perimeter, working the fence lines while the air still held a trace of cool. He rationed the remaining grain, splitting each meal into thin portions, feeling the ache in his ribs when hunger bit deep. Tovan adapted quietly, sitting in the shade of the overhang, hands resting loosely in his lap. He traced symbols in the dust, slow and deliberate, mapping the seasons without words. Cade learned to read the shifts. A deeper line meant drought approaching. A wider circle meant rain on the high mesas. He followed the signs, adjusting the water catchments, reinforcing the canvas against the blistering sun. The canyon felt smaller with each passing day, walls pressing closer, trapping the heat and the silence. He kept his hands flat against his thighs when the tension rose, refusing to fall back on the rifle groove. The habit had served him in the cold. Now it felt like a tether to fear. He stood at the ridge line at noon, squinting against the glare, watching for dust plumes or shifting shadows. Nothing moved. The homestead sat quiet, fences holding, water cache steady but low. The law hadn't returned. The posse hadn't tested the gorge again. The stillness felt fragile, held together by patience and stubborn routine. A sudden drop in the wind silenced the dry grass. The canyon held its breath. Then a sharp, rhythmic drumbeat echoed from the high mesas, faint but steady, carrying down through the heat shimmer, not war drums, marching steps. Cade stepped back from the ridge, pulling his hat low against the glare, and moved toward the shelter. The ground trembled slightly under his boots, a subtle vibration that traveled through the packed earth. He reached the threshold just as a line of riders emerged from the eastern pass, silhouettes sharp against the blinding sky. Painted horses, leather armor, silent procession. They moved without haste, hooves striking the hardpan in perfect unison. The lead rider carried no rifle, only a long wooden staff planted firmly in the dust. Cade stopped 10 yards from the gate, hands resting open at his sides. He didn't reach for iron. The riders halted as one, horses shifting weight in the heat, breath pluming faintly despite the sun. The war chief dismounted, boots settling on dry clay, and walked forward alone. He stopped at the edge of the cleared yard, eyes tracking Cade, then the shelter, then the dry creek bed. He placed both hands on his staff, leaning forward slightly. The canyon kept him alive, the chief said, voice rough but clear. The winter held the line. We return what the earth owes. 2 riders behind him moved forward, carrying a heavy iron-bound chest between them. The wood was dark, banded with rusted steel, corners reinforced with thick hide straps. They set it down at the threshold. The impact kicked dust into the air, thudding against the hard ground with a weight that shifted the yard's fragile balance. Cade didn't step back. He felt the vibration travel up through his boots, settling into his ribs. The chest sat squarely in the sunlight, casting a sharp shadow across the porch boards. The war chief stepped aside, bowing his head once before turning back to his horse. The procession mounted without a word, hooves clicking against stone as they rode back toward the high pass. The dust settled slowly. Cade stood alone in the yard, staring at the iron-bound wood. He knelt beside it, pressing his palm against the rough surface. The leather straps were cold. The hinges were heavy. He didn't open it. He simply traced the edge of the lid, feeling the sharp metal bite into his skin. The weight of it pressed down, not just on the wood, but on the air around him. The canyon's fragile balance had just shifted. He stood, wiping dust from his knees, and stepped toward the gate. The chest remained closed. The question hung in the heat, unspoken but heavy. What does gold buy when the border is drawn in blood? The sun climbed higher, baking the yard until the air shimmered above the hardpan. Cade dragged a worn canvas tarp across the dirt, spreading it beneath the chest's shadow. He needed a clear space, a flat surface, somewhere to work without the dust settling into the seams. He returned to the threshold, kneeling beside the iron bands, and pulled a rusted pry bar from the root cellar. The metal felt heavy, familiar from years of pulling fence posts from frozen ground. He wedged the tip into the gap beneath the lid, feeling the wood resist, then shift. A sharp crack echoed across the yard. The hinge gave way. Dust puffed from the seams as he levered it upward, muscles straining against the weight. The lid fell back against the porch rail. Inside, raw gold caught the harsh sunlight, dull but unmistakable, piled in rough, uneven chunks. No coins, no ingots, just unrefined ore, heavy and unyielding, resting against a bed of dry sage. Cade didn't reach for it. He pressed 2 fingers against the largest piece, feeling the cool, dense surface, the rough edges scraping his calluses. The weight of it anchored his hand. He pulled back, standing slowly, feeling the shift in his posture. The homestead wasn't starving anymore. The county couldn't strip the deed. The posse couldn't burn the fences and walk away clean. Gold changed the terrain. It turned a standoff into a negotiation. But it also painted a target on the yard. Cade closed the lid, dropping the pry bar against the boards, and listened. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of approaching storm clouds from the west. Rain would wash the dust from the yard, but it wouldn't wash away the question. Who else knew the chest had arrived? He stepped toward the ridge line, boots heavy on the dry earth, and scanned the tree line. The high ridges remained quiet. The lower wash stayed still. He felt the brass compass shift in his pocket, tapping against his thigh with each step. North was still north, but the ground beneath him had just changed its weight. He adjusted his grip on the fence post, feeling the rough wood bite into his palm, and waited for the first drop of rain. The first drop hit the dust, kicking up a pale crater, followed by another, then a sudden rush of wind that flattened the dry grass. Cade stood at the ridge edge, watching the storm roll down from the western mesas, dark clouds swallowing the afternoon sun. He turned back toward the yard, moving with deliberate pace, boots sinking into the cooling mud. The canvas tarp needed securing before the downpour hit. He dragged it across the chest, tying the corners to heavy stones, feeling the rain begin to soak through his shirt. The water ran in thin rivulets down the porch boards, washing dust from the threshold. Inside the shelter, Tovan sat quietly, listening to the steady drum of rain against the rock face. He didn't move toward the entrance. He simply pressed his palms flat against the dirt floor, eyes closed, breathing matching the rhythm of the storm. Cade stepped inside, shaking the water from his coat, and knelt beside the elder. He didn't speak. He simply placed a dry strip of jerky beside the water cache, feeling the damp air settle into the narrow space. The storm raged outside, wind howling through the pines, but the shelter held firm. He leaned back against the rock wall, closing his eyes, feeling the familiar ache in his lower back. The gold sat outside, heavy and cold, waiting for the dawn. The county would come. The mob would return. The law would test the boundary again. But the ground had already shifted. Cade traced the edge of the canvas blanket, feeling the worn fabric catch against his thumb, and listened to the rain. The yard would hold, or it would break. He kept his hands still, feeling the storm's weight settle over the canyon. The silence inside the shelter felt different now, not fragile, waiting. He opened his eyes, watching the water pool at the threshold, and prepared for the morning. The heavy iron bands of the chest caught the morning sun, throwing long, sharp shadows across the dry yard. Cade knelt beside the lid, pry bar resting against his knee, feeling the cold bite of rusted steel through his gloves. 3 riders stood at the edge of the cleared ground, their dusters dusted with trail ash, their horses shifting restlessly in the heat. The lead man, a hired hand with a scarred jaw and a silver-trimmed hat, stepped forward, boots crunching on baked clay. He stopped 10 yards out, letting the reins slip through his fingers, and spat into the dust. "We know what you found," he said, voice flat and carrying over the quiet wind. "Name a price. We haul the ore to the rail. You walk away with a clean stake and empty pockets. The valley burns for gold anywhere. Might as well let the fire spend itself on someone else's land. Cade didn't look up. He kept his eyes fixed on the rough-hewn planks beneath the chest, feeling the familiar ache in his shoulders. His thumb drifted to his right thigh, seeking the phantom weight of the rifle, searching for the worn groove he'd traced for months. The habit pulled at him, steady and automatic. He forced his hand down. He didn't need the wood to brace him now. He needed his hands bare. He stood slowly, boots settling into the hardpan, and wiped a smear of grime from his cheek. "The ore stays," he replied. The words landed heavy, cutting through the dry air. The mercenary's jaw tightened. He adjusted his grip on the saddle horn, leather creaking in the heat. "Then you hold a mountain of trouble for nothing. The county judge will seize it for taxes. The mob will torch your barn to smoke it out. You'll die guarding a pile of rock that feeds no one." Cade stepped closer, boots leaving fresh marks on the dust, and felt the morning wind shift against his coat. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small brass key he'd fashioned from a bent nail. He didn't speak. He simply walked to the chest, knelt, and slid the key into the rusted lock. The mechanism caught, then gave with a dull metallic clack. He lifted the heavy lid. The gold inside gleamed dully, rough chunks piled against dry sage, heavy and unrefined. He pressed 2 fingers against the largest piece, feeling the cold density, the sharp edges scraping his calluses. The weight of it anchored his stance. He turned back to the riders, keeping his hands visible at his sides. "I don't guard it," he said. "I divide it." The mercenary stepped back, boots shifting on loose gravel. He signaled his men to hold position, eyes tracking Cade's every move. The yard felt smaller, the air thick with unspent tension. Cade dragged a heavy canvas tarp across the dirt, spreading it beneath the chest's shadow, and began lifting the ore out piece by piece. Each drop kicked dust into the air, settling on his forearms, mixing with sweat into pale streaks. He stacked them in neat rows, measuring by weight, not by greed. The work pulled at his lower back, a familiar strain from years of hauling fence posts. He ignored it, focusing on the rhythm of metal against wood, feeling the heat climb through the morning. The mercenary watched in silence, hand resting loosely near his coat, reading the shift in the yard's balance. The offer had been made. The answer had been given. Now the ground would either hold or it would crack under the weight of the choice. Word traveled fast across the dry washes and sun-baked trails. By late afternoon, riders began to appear at the ridge line, silhouettes sharp against the glaring sky. Homesteaders from the eastern flats, dusters faded, rifles slung across saddles, rode down into the yard with cautious steps. They kept their distance, boots planted on the hardpan, eyes fixed on the stacked ore. Then came the tribal riders, painted horses moving slow, led by 2 younger men who carried the elders' markings on their shoulders. They dismounted without a word, standing beside the homesteaders, tension thick in the shared space. Cade didn't wait for agreement. He walked to the first pile, lifting a heavy chunk of raw gold, and placed it into a worn leather satchel belonging to the nearest homesteader. The man flinched, hands hovering near his belt, before slowly taking the weight. The ore settled with a dull thud. Cade moved to the next, then the next, dividing the mountain into measured shares, feeling the strain in his wrists as the stacks grew heavier. He didn't count coins. He didn't negotiate shares. He simply handed the weight down one by one until the chest sat empty except for a scattering of dust and dry leaves. The yard shifted. Rifles lowered. Shoulders dropped. The tangible cost arrived immediately. His own barn stood empty behind him, shelves bare, grain sacks flattened, the iron-bound chest stripped to its frame. He felt the hollow ache in his ribs, the sharp awareness of winter approaching with empty larders. He had traded survival for a line in the dirt. The homesteaders packed their shares in silence, tying leather straps tight across saddles, mounting with careful grace. The tribal riders stepped forward, pressing a single carved stone into Cade's palm before turning toward their horses. The weight of the stone felt cool, familiar, anchoring. Cade closed his fingers around it, feeling the sharp edges bite into his skin. He didn't look back at the barn. He watched the riders file out through the lower wash, hooves kicking up pale clouds that drifted across the hardpan. The yard felt vast, exposed, stripped of its shield. He stood alone in the fading light, listening to the wind pick up, carrying the scent of cooling earth and distant rain. A sudden gust dropped the temperature 10 degrees in a single breath. The dry grass flattened, birds silenced. The air went still. Then a sharp crack echoed from the high ridge, not gunfire, but the sound of a heavy branch splitting under ice weight. Winter had arrived early, riding down the canyon walls on a sudden front. Cade stepped back toward the threshold, pulling his coat collar high, feeling the first flakes catch in his lashes. The mercenaries still stood at the tree line, dusters flapping in the sudden chill. The lead rider turned his horse, reins slipping through his grip, and watched the snow begin to dust the yard. He didn't speak. He simply nodded once, sharp and final, before spurring his mount into the timber. The others followed, hooves fading into the whiteout. The retreat left the yard quiet, heavy with unspoken acknowledgement. The mob wouldn't ride in tonight. The law wouldn't test the boundary in this weather. The snow had drawn a temporary line, and Cade had already paid to cross it. He dragged a fresh canvas tarp over the porch steps, pinning it beneath loose stones, feeling the damp settle through his sleeves. He knelt beside the empty chest, brushing frost from the iron bands, and pressed his palm flat against the wood. The cold seeped into his skin, sharp and clean. He had given away the gold. He had kept the ground. The valley would feel the shift by morning. He stood, wiping his hands on his trousers, and stepped toward the barn. The empty shelves stared back at him, waiting for the long months ahead. He closed the heavy wooden doors, sliding the iron latch into place, feeling the metal bite into his grip. The wind howled through the pines, carrying the sound of shifting timber and distant, muffled voices. He turned his back to the yard, feeling the snow accumulate on his shoulders, and prepared for the dark. The thaw came slow the following spring, dragging mud and fresh green through the lower wash. Cade worked the fence lines before dawn, pulling rusted wire tight around weathered posts, feeling the familiar strain in his forearms. He didn't count the seasons anymore. He measured them in mended gates, cleared trails, and quiet mornings that broke without the sound of approaching hooves. Tovan's kin returned each year, riding through the high pass with fresh horses and heavier packs, leaving carved stones on the porch rail as they passed. The homesteaders rode the opposite trail, sharing water rights, leaving extra grain in the shared cache, acknowledging the line without crossing it. The canyon didn't heal overnight. It settled. The dust thinned. The fences held. The brass compass sat on the porch table, glass scratched, needle steady, pointing north through every shift in wind and weather. Cade kept his hands moving, never letting them idle long enough to search for the old groove. The habit had broken when he divided the ore. It didn't return. He found steadiness in the work instead, in the rhythm of wire on pine, in the quiet exchange of tools at the property edge. He stood at the ridge line at noon, watching the sun bake the hardpan, feeling the heat settle into his coat. The homestead below sat quiet, roof patched, water trough full, tracks crossing the yard without raising alarm. The heavy chest sat unused in the sunlit corner of the barn, iron bands rusted further, wood darkened by years of damp and dust. It held nothing but dry air and old shadows. It didn't need to hold more. It stood as a marker, silent and heavy, reminding anyone who looked of the night a broken gate kept two worlds from tearing each other apart. Cade adjusted his grip on the fence post, feeling the rough wood bite into his palm, and let the quiet settle into the dust. The wind swept through the valley, carrying the steady rhythm of hooves from the eastern trail, moving slow, moving calm, bringing no fear, only the weight of the ground. He closed his eyes, listening to the sound fade into the trees, and let the silence hold. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help this old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matter. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.